Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching this stream on YouTube, on Rumble, and on Gun Jing Word. The other day, I was on YouTube looking for podcast conversations, and I came across Firas Modad, and I found his analysis brilliant, fascinating, especially the way he connects the dots and also the events in order to bring historical context into the current events so that the people can understand why things are happening nowadays in the Middle East. Something that I have to say is very, very rare nowadays, especially among the self-proclaimed experts on the Middle East or the self-proclaimed experts on Syria. This podcast was on Peter McCormack's YouTube channel. I will link this video when this conversation is over in the first comment so you can go and watch it together. And since then, I followed Firas Modad on X, and I wanted to have him on my YouTube channel, Syriana Analysis, so that we discuss together the major events that happened in Syria and in the broader Middle East since the cessation of power of Bashar in Syria. Firas's X account is, of course, in the description, and also his website is in the description below. Firas, thank you so much for coming to Syriana Analysis. It's a really pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Very grateful.
I'm actually, there are always a few people that I look up to when I want to learn, and it's a really always a humbling experience to listen to people like yourself. And I think the audience of Syriana Analysis would appreciate a lot your insights. And this is something like in politics, we don't always agree on the events and the outcome of the events. Therefore, there are few things that I heard you saying during this podcast the other day, and I would really like to touch on these topics together. So we have the far history that you addressed, let's say on Peter's podcast. We were going to start with the cessation of power, Bashar's cessation of power, let's say in 2000. And this was interesting because he wasn't supposed to be a president of Syria. His brother Bassel, the older son, was being, let's say, groomed to become the president. And he was in the military, respected among the generals and officers. And he was ascending, let's say, in the positions in the Syrian army, slowly but surely to become later a president. And then we had the car accident of Bassel. I think he had a trip to Paris or to London, and there was a Lufthansa flight was waiting for him. He was really fast on the highway, and he had a crash, and he died. Hafez called Bashar, and he told him, you need to come back to Syria. And this was in 1994. So Bashar basically had 6 years to be prepared for presidency. So Bashar comes to Syria, and I truly think that Hafez was a really strategic mastermind when it comes to the, let's say, geopolitical issues in the region. But here comes the catch. Why he wanted to give this power to his son when he was really young, let's say, to become a leader of a country, especially to fill the shoes of his father. And his father was, let's say, a very strong man. He had the option of Abdel Halim Khaddam back then, and he had the option of Mustafa Atlas, and both were from very influential Sunni families, but he chose Bashar as the successor. In my opinion, back then, if Khaddam or Atlas served, let's say, 7 years, and Bashar would have become 40 years in 2007, this would have been much better for Bashar also and for the country. But in this case, when you see this transition happening of power back then, how do you evaluate first Hafez's decision to give power to his son, very young, who wasn't groomed in the military as his older son Bassel, and now, let's say, fast forward 2024, we see, I think the evaluation would be more tangible, more practical for us to understand whether it was a success story or a failure.
Look, I mean, so much of this is contingent on what would have happened during Bashar's term. If 9/11 had not happened, if the Americans hadn't decided to try to democratize the Middle East, we can't speculate this way. But I think that for the Assad family, it was natural to want to keep things in the family. Monarchy is the most natural form of government. And since he had prepared his son to succeed him, Basil, when he was met with this disappointment, he wasn't going to change his plan. The guy was trying to found a dynasty. And you saw this with Bashar naming his own son Hafiz and trying to prepare his son for succeeding him one day. So essentially what they were trying to do was turn the country into a monarchy. And this is you saw this in Egypt with Hosni Mubarak trying to pass on the torch to Gamal Mubarak. That was one of the reasons that the army turned against Mubarak in the 2011 protests. And you saw this with Libya, with Gaddafi grooming Saif al-Islam to succeed him. So this is perfectly natural. This is perfectly normal. What was unnatural was these countries pretending to be republics when they had none of the intellectual background, none of the traditions that would allow for republican rule in these kinds of highly tribal, highly divided, highly patriarchal, nepotistic societies. So I don't blame Hafiz for choosing the next son down the line. This was just the luck of the draw. And that's where he ended up.
Yes, he ended up there, and Bashar comes in 2000. 1 year later, 9/11 happens. I think the Middle East turns upside down. At the beginning, Bashar cooperates with the CIA, and I think even after 2001, some of the detainees of Al-Qaeda were being tortured in Syria, as far as I know, and Bush used to send them to Syria. So Bashar cooperated with the US when it came to Al-Qaeda. But then in 2003, when the invasion of Iraq happened, you mentioned that Syria opened the borders with Iraq. In this case, we learned in Syria, let's say this is the version of the government I'm delivering to you on the press, in the curriculum, etc., that Syria supported the resistance. But you say that Assad or Bashar has opened the borders for everyone.
So let's take a step back. Let's take a step back to 1990. 1990, Iraq invades Kuwait. And the Americans tell Hafiz al-Assad, we want your support for the liberation of Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. And the price that he demands is consolidation over Lebanon. So the Israelis, for the first time since way before, allow the Syrian Air Force to operate freely in Lebanese airspace, to bomb the Lebanese presidential palace. The Syrians end the civil war in Lebanon on their terms. And this was at a time when the Assad family was accused of supporting radical Palestinian organizations, of opposing peace, etc., etc. Then you had the 1990s period, where you had the Oslo Accord and then the Wadi Araba Accord in Jordan. And there was serious talk that the Syrians would end up making a peace treaty with the Israelis. Netanyahu gets elected in 96, dampens that. Ehud Barak gets elected and tries to make a final offer to Arafat. It breaks down. And so the Syrians are in this limbo. Are they going to join the American project? Or are they going to stay as the last holdout state that refuses peace with Israel? And in a sense, the choice was made for them, because an Alawi president making peace with the Israelis would always trigger a big backlash from the Sunni population that the Muslim Brotherhood would try to exploit and resume its armed activities. 2001 happens, 9/11 happens, and the Americans say that we have a plan to fundamentally change everything in the Middle East.
Yes.
And the plan includes Iraq, Syria, by implication, Lebanon, Libya, Sudan, and Iran. And if you look since then, each of these countries has been dealt with the exception of Iran.
Yes.
So this is the setting in which Bashar takes power. He initially tries to open up a little bit. And there is the so-called Damascus Spring. It ends up being short-lived, etc. Then he sees that the Americans are going to crack down, and he sees that his own rule isn't fully secure. So he resumes the old practices of no dissent, no toleration for rival political parties, no political life in Syria allowed. When the Iraq invasion happens, Bashar sees that the American army is right at his doorstep.
Yeah.
And so he has a fundamental interest in making sure that the Americans don't succeed. And he shares that interest with the Iranians. But they end up backing different groups.
Yes.
The Iranians end up backing the Shia of Iraq,
Mhm.
and you have the Badr organization growing out into now a dozen different organizations that have broken off of it. And you have the Syrian government using various Sunni clerics and channeling radicalized youth, including Abu Muhammad al-Julani, to go and fight in Iraq. This is what the Syrians meant by backing the resistance. The language that was used, if you look at the early takeover of Islamic State in 2014, if you looked at Al Jazeera, they were saying that this was the Iraqi resistance that was winning.
Yes.
That it wasn't a bunch of insane, holistic, radical head choppers. This was just the Iraqi resistance. When in reality, Islamic State guys were going to the protests by the Iraqi Sunnis and telling them, you're fools to trust in peaceful protests. The only way forward is our form of radical jihad.
Yes.
So this language that you guys were taught at school, it's understandable. They don't want to say who they were backing. But ultimately, in the Middle East, for the most part, Muslims end up fighting for deeply Islamic causes.
Yes.
And that takes on a jihadi aspect. And that's what Bashar al-Assad ended up backing. Because he saw that he was going to be next. And since he saw the role of somebody like Iyad Allawi and Ahmad Shalabi in Iraq, where these guys were basically brought in as tools for the Americans to rule in their stead, him and the Iranians decided to identify, or who could clearly identify, who could be Lebanon's Shalabi or Syria's Shalabi, and they thought it would naturally be Rafi al-Hariri.
Yes.
Given that Rafi al-Hariri is on record bragging to the Syrian foreign minister, and this is recorded, you can find it on YouTube, saying that the reason President Jacques Chirac of France turned against the Syrians and backed Resolution 1559 to expel the Syrian forces was because Rafi Hariri, had told him to. So Hariri was playing a very dangerous game at the time. We saw with the Iraq invasion that that any UN resolution would end up being used by the Americans and by the British to justify an invasion.
Yes.
So Rafi Hariri and Marwan Ahmadi, one of Walid Jumblat's closest advisors, cooperated to get 1559 UN resolution 1559 issued. This resolution called for the full withdrawal of Syrian forces and the dismantlement of armed groups, implying the Palestinian groups and Hezbollah. This was seen by the Syrians and by the Iranians as paving the way for a military attack on Syria. So you had these pieces moving together. You had this anti-Syrian opposition that was fermenting in Lebanon. It wasn't anti-Syrian as much as it was anti-Bashar personally, because all of the Lebanese leaders had a great relationship with the Syrian state under Hafiz al-Assad. And they found ways to make money with people like Khaddam, with people like Ghazi Kanaan, with people like Hikmat Shabi. They were able to cooperate and to make money together in Lebanon and in Syria. But Bashar, as part of his consolidation, was getting rid of the Syrian old guard. And this included people like Abdul Halim Khaddam, who was extremely close to Rafi Hariri. And given Rafi Hariri's relationships internationally with the Saudis, with the Arabs, with the French, with the Americans, and within Syria, he was seen as the most credible Sunni leader for both Lebanon and potentially Syria itself. And he was seen as a potential Ahmad Jalabi that could be brought in to rule instead of Bashar.
This is Khaddam.
No, I'm talking about Hariri, possibly in partnership with somebody like Khaddam.
Okay, so Hariri rules Lebanon and Syria is by
Ends up
Khaddam
under
in this case.
Khaddam or ends up under somebody who is willing to align with the Saudis and with the rest of the Arabs, with the Americans by implication.
Yes. So here comes the assassination of Hariri during this.
So here comes the assassination of Hariri, which came right before the 2005 election in Lebanon.
Yes.
Saad Hariri runs instead. You remember that first the crowds thought that it was going to be Baha al-Hariri, but the family and it seems the Saudis wanted Saad.
Yes.
And it turns out they were right. Because Baha since then has shown to be a much less desirable politician and a much less sympathetic politician than Saad.
Yes. But here you say that it is Hezbollah who did the operation, right?
Look,
or you believe
the investigation hinged essentially on one major piece of evidence, which the Lebanese knew about immediately after the assassination. Now, when we talk about the assassination, let's explore a couple of things. Firstly, in terms of the evidence, let's get that point out of the way. They found a network of telephone numbers that were only communicating with each other within two other networks, and they tied this network credibly to Hezbollah, to operatives within Hezbollah. Does that mean Nasrallah gave the order, or does that mean Imad Mughni gave the order? We don't know, because understanding the chain of command of Hezbollah at the time is very ambiguous. We also know that what I try to do as an analyst is to try to understand the morality of the other side. Okay? Yes. We know that in Islam there is the ayat al-hiraba. وَإِنَّمَا جَزَاءُ الَّذِينَ يُحَارِبُونَ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَيَسْعَوْنَ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَسَادًا أَنْ يُقَتَّلُوا أَوْ يُصَلَّبُوا أَوْ تُقَطَّعَ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَأَرْجُلُهُم مِّنْ خِلَافٍ, etc. This Quranic verse is used to give the ruler permission to kill, but only the ruler, subject to his own discretion. If I was to put myself in the mind of a religious organization like Hezbollah and say that avoiding fitna, because fitna is worse than murder in the Quran, is a noble cause, and that Hariri is trying to instigate fitna by bringing French and American and British support against Syria in a way that could end up causing a civil war as in Iraq. From that perspective, if I was to adopt that morality, from that perspective, they would view it as legitimate to kill Hariri. And from the Syrians' perspective, given Bashar's internal problems, that he hadn't consolidated, that there was an American army right across the border fighting in Anbar and willing to go into Syria, then I would endorse the idea of getting rid of the principal ally of the United States in Lebanon. This is what I try to do as an analyst. I try to take the other guy's perspective and adopt it and see the world through his eyes.
And if we reverse this analysis, let's say if we follow the sequence of events which followed the assassination and who profited from the assassination, some may also argue, I'm not talking about now, like I don't have a tangible evidence in my hand, I'm just like trying to discuss. What if Hariri was a pawn on the chessboard that they had to sacrifice to trigger a color revolution which brings or changes the mood completely in Lebanon and triggers a revolution, basically, which happened, an uprising against the Syrian presence there. And here, Khaddam could be one of the collaborators as let's say, a de facto ruler of Lebanon under the Syrian mandate, right? Because Khaddam also had an invested interest in kicking Bashar out of power. He wanted also to the presidency. So what if the Syrian regime was infiltrated from within?
So then you look at the other pieces. Then you look at the other pieces of the puzzle. On the day of the assassination, or within a couple of days of the assassination, there was no effort made to preserve the scene of the crime. As a matter of fact, the internal security guys who were being fully run by Syria's allies, Mustafa Hamdan, I think, and Jamil al-Sayyid, and the other officers who were arrested by Detlef Meles and who were placed in prison for 4 years and then exonerated. It's important to mention that in the end they were exonerated. These guys essentially ruined the scene of the crime, as opposed to preserving it and investigating it. The question then becomes, was it incompetence or malice? I mean, I think it's pretty basic to say we want to preserve the scene of the crime. I don't think it could be incompetence. I don't think opening the road that day or in the next few days would have been a priority, you know? So you had this concerted cover-up to try to disrupt the scene of the crime and to leave as little evidence as possible. Then you had the statement of Ahmed Adas, a man who seems to have been feeble-minded, to put it politely, who issued a statement saying, we are so-and-so organization and we've killed the apostate Hariri, which no one believed and no one took seriously, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that no, they got rid of the Americans' man in the country, and then they found a bigger backlash than they expected. Remember, the color revolution didn't come as a reaction to the assassination. This is a big misconception. The uprising came as a reaction to March 8th, when Hassan Nasrallah rallied with Nabih Berri and big groups of the Shia to say, thank you, Syria, 3 weeks after the assassination of Hariri. This is what actually provoked the Sunnis and the Christians to a huge extent. Between February 14 and March 14, there was a trickle of people going to protest who weren't really massing any significant numbers and who weren't really a threat to the establishment. What threatened them was the resignation of Karami, the prime minister of the time, basically the Sunnis saying that we as Sunnis allied with Syria cannot take the killing of Hariri, which Nabih Berri famously said, wait a few minutes, let us discuss this. How could you just resign in public like that? And then the March 8 protest, which preceded the March 14 protest, to say, thank you, Syria, that triggered the uprising, not the assassination itself. It was that after all of these years of the Syrian presence in Lebanon, and then the assassination of the only guy who had done some things economically in Lebanon that were good, with a huge amount of bad, which is the debt, which blew up in our faces in 2019. So let's not sugarcoat that part either. And incidentally, it was Syria's allies in parliament who were saying to Hariri, don't borrow all of this money in foreign currency, you will bankrupt us one day. So let's be fair to all sides here. But it was in fact the protest of thank you, Syria on March 8, which actually triggered March 14. And this is what generated the media images and the international pressure that, combined with the American military presence in Iraq, really forced the Syrians to pull out, because then the threats had become very serious.
Yes.
Previously, Colin Powell had visited Syria and told them, look, guys, you could be next. After the March 14 protest, if the Americans wanted to attack Syria, they would have had zero problem justifying it internationally.
Yes.
So there's no way that the Syrians could have foreseen that this would trigger a mass uprising. They genuinely
they don't expect such reactions, because I've closely followed the policies of the Syrian, let's call it a regime, leadership, whatever, after 2011, and they lack complete understanding of the psychology of the people, of the masses. How could they shape it?
But that's a different conversation. But yes, this is absolutely true.
And how events could trigger, let's say, social events. Like if we're just speculating here. I'm just speculating here. If the assassination was planned by Syria, let's say on a leadership level, and Bashar was aware of it in order to achieve certain, let's say, results. I think this is a very unwise decision to kill one of the most, let's say, beloved politicians, at least among the Sunnis. Meanwhile, you being an Alawite, seen as an Alawite leader in Syria,
Yes.
will definitely create this vertical rift in the region. Meanwhile, in Iraq, there has been a civil war going on between the Sunnis and the Shias at the same time.
Look, there's something to be said about the arrogance of youth here. Because if you remember, before the assassination, Hariri told everybody important in Lebanon, Jumblat, Sabah, Ahmadi, all of these characters, he told them about his meeting with Assad, where Assad had told him, I will break Lebanon on you and Walid Jumblat's heads. It was Walid Jumblat who had first initiated the pressure to get the Syrians out in around 2000 or 2001. And it was in partnership with Patriarch Sfair. And if you know the history of Lebanon, when the Druze and the Maronites are in agreement, everybody else has to settle down because they dominate the mountain. And if they dominate the mountain, they dominate the coast, given how narrow it is.
Yeah.
They're speaking in strategic geopolitical terms, you know?
Yes.
Druze-Christian accords in Lebanon can be transformative. So you not only had a Druze-Christian accord, you started to have a Druze-Christian-Sunni accord on getting the Syrians out. It doesn't mean that it would have been a democracy. I mean, at the time, Walid Jumblat said when he saw the elections in Iraq that it was like a scene from a dream or something like that. And that if it could happen in Iraq and the Iraqis could have free, fair elections, then maybe we can do this in Lebanon and we can do this in Syria.
Yep.
Because again, the mindset is that these aren't separate countries. These are a geopolitical continuum. They're not one people, because that is also an absurdity, but they're also not separate nation states either.
Yes.
They spill over into each other in a weird Levantine way that only works with strong authoritarian rule. So this is the nature of the region that we're dealing with. Assad saw a major threat, as did Hezbollah. And they believed that Hariri and co. were ready to sign a peace treaty with Israel, and that this would essentially isolate both the Assads and Hezbollah. And so they retaliated against that threat by getting rid of the single most important man in this equation, who was Rafiq Hariri.
And in this case, we had Ghazi Kanaan. Was he present in Lebanon when the assassination happened?
I think
we
so.
don't know, right? Yeah, and then he was
in charge of the Lebanon file at the time. I don't know if he was physically in Lebanon, but then he
was allegedly
suicided. He committed suicide. He was suicided. He was.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because there are a few things that I remembered now because, I was in the region when all these events happened. I just want to mention a few personal stories. We started with the 9/11. I remember when 9/11 happened, I was at home and my father was in his business and he called me. I was a child and he told me, you hold your mother's hand and you go to the first sarraf, like to exchange money. And he had, I don't know, like $2,000-3,000 at home. That's it. And he was afraid that the dollar would lose its value. So you go and exchange it with Syrian lira. So I was a child holding my mother's hand, running to the sarraf so that we exchanged these dollars to Syrian lira. And then, of course, 2003 was very tragic for me. But 2005, when the assassination of Rafiq al-Hariri happened, I remember this was the Valentine's Day, and I was still very young, like not really understanding what's going on. But in Syria, it was reported, let's say, widely, and then. Like surprisingly or accidentally, coincidentally, when I started studying international relations and diplomacy in Damascus, this was a private university, so my bachelor degree, the professor of international law was basically the person who was leading the Syrian legal committee in the Rafiq al-Hariri assassination from the Syrian side, because there has been these court sessions and rulings and stuff. So every time you turn on your TV, on every Arabic TV outlet, from Jazeera, from Arabiya, from Hurra, from everywhere, you see his face. And his name was Dr. Ibrahim Daraji. So the last time I saw him was in August 2011. And this was when in Damascus, Assad organized a dialogue conference with the opposition in Al-Sahara compound, and he invited me to this conference because he was my professor, and he said you had the highest GPA at school and at the university, and he invited me. And on our way back, everybody was sitting in their Mercedes and all these fancy cars, and I was waiting for a taxi outside the hotel. And Ibrahim Davaji saw me. Basically, he was really kind, actually, and he stopped and he said, "Kevork, what are you doing here? Like, you're on the highway?" And I said, "Yes, I want to go to Damascus." And he said, "Come, I drive you to Damascus." On our way, he told me, "I will tell you something now, and don't tell anybody, but in 2-3 hours, everybody will know it. And I'm going to resign tonight, and from the government, from everything, because this was in August 2011. And he said, because Bashar is not serious with the reforms or talking with the opposition. And I'm from Daraa, and my people, there is a lot of blood there, and I'm trying to mediate between the government and or Bashar and the people, but it seems things are will go out of control, so I will resign. You will hear about it in few hours anyways on the TV." And yes, in few hours they were like breaking news that he's leaving the government back. And so many people who were part of the government started leaving, let's say, for many miscalculations from the Syrian government side. And then we had, of course, we talked about the assassination, came the July war 2006. Now, if I take your analysis and understand it and accept it, there could be also the argument that Hezbollah waged this kidnapping operation against IDF soldiers to trigger a war against Lebanon. Or how do you see that? Because Hezbollah's credibility was shaken in, let's say, in 2005, and 2006 consolidated the power of Hezbollah over Lebanon.
Look, couple of points here. 2006, you had the dialogue going on in Lebanon over the question of Hezbollah's weapons. What are we going to do? How do we find a peaceful way to disarm Hezbollah? And this was also when assassinations in Lebanon were beginning to kick off. More assassinations than just Hariri. You had the 2006 war. I don't think Hezbollah actually predicted an all-out Israeli war at this scale. And I don't think they would have been certain that the war would have gone in their favor. I mean, whatever you think about Hassan Nasrallah, the guy was calculating, and he understood that war is a big adventure where the outcome wouldn't be certain, I mean. Yeah. What he got was a strange combination in Israel where he had Ehud Olmert as prime minister, and he had the guy from the Labour Party as defense minister, who was a unionist, who was a union official before becoming defense minister in Israel, yes, who was one of the only Israeli defense ministers with no serious military background. None whatsoever. The Israelis weren't expecting a big war. They thought that their withdrawal in 2000 would have solved things. And Hezbollah wasn't expecting a big war either. One Russian assessment I know of was that the Israelis fought extremely poorly in 2006. And that it didn't have to be this embarrassing for them. I mean, remember, they failed to get into Bint Jbeil, which was 2.5 kilometers from the border, if I remember correctly.
Yes, yes.
They failed to get into Maroun al-Ras, which is less than a kilometer from the border.
Yes.
They struggled to get into Maroun al-Ras. On the ground, it was catastrophic for them. And they had no idea what they were doing. And it seems that their intelligence on Hezbollah was extremely poor. And it seems that their preparations for war were non-existent.
Hmm.
So Hezbollah fought very well, obviously. And it was impressive what they did with anti-tank weapons and how they used anti-tank weapons and how they had properly prepared their positions, because they were certain that the Israelis would come back.
Hmm.
So this war didn't necessarily have to go this way, and Hezbollah couldn't have known. Hezbollah launched the war to try to retrieve a couple of prisoners, or a few Lebanese prisoners. Because of the size of the war, they managed to exact a pretty heavy price from the Israelis by 2008 when the prisoner releases happened.
Hmm.
They released all of the Lebanese prisoners and a big bunch of Palestinians and other Arab and so on. And this was the peak of Hezbollah's popularity in the Sunni world. This empowered them enormously in Lebanon, but not fully. Because in 2008, the Lebanese cabinet decides that we're going to remove Hezbollah's weapons from its hands. Not weapons, sorry. They decide that we're going to dismantle Hezbollah's communications network. Exactly.
Yes.
Remember, from 2006, from November 2006 till May 2008, Hezbollah was protesting against the sitting Lebanese cabinet, the duly elected Lebanese cabinet, because the Shia ministers had resigned, and they declared that if the cabinet couldn't appoint Shia ministers, then it couldn't govern. And there were assassinations going on in Lebanon all the time at that period. They killed, I think, 4 MPs, a couple of generals, three or four journalists, and attempted assassinations going on with that, which meant that no Shia would dare enter cabinet as a challenger to them. And they declared that the government wasn't legitimate. So we had this protracted crisis after the 2006 war.
This was the sit-ins, right? The campings in front of the...
This was the sit-ins in downtown Beirut, in the Soider area, where Hezbollah said, essentially to the Sunnis, screw you and screw Rafi al-Hariri's legacy. Rafi al-Hariri's legacy was the reconstruction of Beirut, with all of the criticism that deserves for the way that it was done, fair enough. But that was his legacy, and it was an impressive legacy. And the Shia decided we're going to attack specifically that. 2008, the Lebanese cabinet says we're going to dismantle Hezbollah's communications network because it's installed illegally, which is true. It is installed illegally. And in theory, the state should decide which communications network run through it. That's part of being sovereign. And Hezbollah decides we're going to occupy Beirut.
This was the Qamsan al-Sud, right? The black...
No, the Qamsan al-Sud was a later episode when they just deployed to the street without fighting.
Yes.
This one was full-on fighting. 100 people were killed. Hariri had prepared a proto-militia from the rural areas of Akkar to go and fight in Beirut under the guise of being security companies. They were absolutely no match for Hezbollah. And they got eliminated. And there was the massacre against the SSNP somewhere in Kura, where they killed, where they tortured and killed 8 or 10 members of the SSNP.
I remember the video.
Yeah, exactly. It was pretty atrocious. So this is what broke the gridlock. And it was only then that Hezbollah fully consolidated in Lebanon, and it became obvious to anyone that you cannot govern without Hezbollah accepting. And Hezbollah's candidate for the presidency, which was vacant at the time, was the chief of the army, Michel Sleiman, and they got him. And then he turned against them.
Yes.
Because he saw that you can't have a state and a militia coexisting. Either everybody gets a militia or there is a state. But you can't have a state and a militia. So this was when Hezbollah consolidated. It didn't happen just after the 2006 war. They had to fight a mini civil war, which lasted thankfully only 3 days. But in those 3 days, they demonstrated to the Sunnis that you are not ready to challenge us. Which brings us to the issue of radicalization. The reason that these Sunnis were so bad militarily was because they were just regular people as opposed to radicals, which is exactly what happened in Syria. The most secular militias were the guys who were defeated first. Not just because Assad prioritized them, but because they were the ones with the least conviction.
Yes. They're not ready to die.
Not in large enough numbers, easily enough, and that matters.
Yes, exactly. We've seen this as it becomes like a ticking bomb during wars. And when people are ready to die and blow up themselves, let's say, for a cause, for a higher cause. I have documented hundreds of videos. I was obsessed about downloading these videos from YouTube like 10, 14 years ago when they used to post 240p videos from Syria. Back then, we didn't have all these good smartphone cameras. YouTube used to allow such content, so I used to download them, and then everything has been deleted from YouTube. Then I have a lot of huge data. It's crazy how can brains manipulate people's actions in a way that you're going to die. Not only to die, you're going to blow up yourself, and you're talking in a very convincing way. Everyone that I watched, they were very convinced. They were not afraid. They were going to die. So it's really difficult to deal politically, let's say, with this type of mentality.
To help emphasize your point, Islamic State had to have waiting lists for suicide bombers because many people were willing. And there was a rumor going on that the Saudis were paying to have their guys go first so that the Saudi Arabia would get rid of the Saudi radicals within Islamic State quickly.
Wow.
I don't know if this was true or not, but I was hearing that kind of thing. And the other thing to mention about this is that the training manuals of Al-Qaeda and that were then adopted by Islamic State emphasized the importance of not letting commanders and competent people actually go to suicide bombings too soon, and making sure that they waited their turn and that they could continue to function in leadership positions for long enough to benefit the cause rather than simply blowing themselves up.
You reminded me also of an interview basically with you said the Saudis were paying money to go to Syria, right? And to get rid of them. Yeah, there was a rumor. And now I can tell you something that is not a rumor. I watched it with my own eyes and I heard it with my own ears. This was in 2014 on the German ZDF TV. A German investigative journalist from ZDF, like trying to track where all these Germans going to in Syria and in Iraq and joining ISIS. How are they leaving Germany to begin with? How can they go to an airport and just basically fly and go to Syria? And basically they're going to Turkey. So he goes to the head of the German, they call it the Landeskriminalamt. It's like an office for criminal activities, and there is the terrorism department. And he meets with the head of this office, and he asks him, "Does Germany know that these people are going to Syria and Iraq to join ISIS?" I was so shocked to hear the answer, very honest, saying, "We don't only know that they're going to Syria to join ISIS, when some of them were under the watch of the intelligence, secret service, so they don't have travel document. When they come and asking us for travel document because they want to leave the country, we give them the travel document to leave the country because those are dangerous people." And the journalist basically says, "So you're exporting this danger to other place?" And he does like this. Like, what can he say about it?
I don't think it was just the Germans. I think it was done in many, many parts of the world. I mean, look, with the Afghan jihad, we know that these people were encouraged. You know, we know that clerics were released from prisons in order to preach this message, in order to get these people to go. And in Syria, something similar happened. This doesn't make Islamic State only a Western conspiracy. That would be an absurd claim. And this does mean that Islamic State was riddled with double agents.
Mm.
So you have this tendency to oversimplify some of these questions and not to respect the fact that groups like Islamic State operate at a weird intersection between legitimate ideological narratives that are based on mainstream readings of Islamic scripture, as well as the interests of various regional and foreign intelligence agencies that are both trying to achieve geopolitical objectives, in this case, getting Syria unstable to reduce the threat to Israel, as well as cleaning house and getting rid of undesirables who are in their countries, who could pose a threat, and sending them to die somewhere else. So this is the narrative that nobody likes.
Yes.
On the Islamist side, Islamic State is just a conspiracy. It's only the Israelis and the Westerners, and they're the ones who have created it. This is what Hassan Nasrallah says. This is what elements who are supportive of political Islam say, etc., etc. On the flip side, this is what Islam is, and this is what all Muslims are. The reality is slightly more nuanced. This is a legitimate interpretation of Islam. Islamic State didn't do anything that didn't have support from two of the four Sunni madhabs. But
which mazhabs?
So the four mainstream madhabs, the Hanafi, Hanbali, Shafi'i, and Maliki.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Islamic State in their literature, they would give very solid justifications for what they were doing, from taking sabaya, taking sex slaves, to dealing with the Christians and taxing them, to the burning of the pilot. They had a very long discourse about it, to assassinations. They had a very long publication about why assassinations were Islamically valid and were in fact a proper sunnah of Muhammad. But they couldn't have grown to this extent had there not been an open tap of weapons and supplies going into Syria that enabled them to grow in the way that they did. So this is the sad reality, that both sides are sort of right about each other. And this is what you find when you look at the Middle East. You find that the worst critics of Assad have a very good point, and the supporters of Assad have a very good point.
To be honest with you, after 2018, there weren't many supporters for Assad. Like, I'm being very honest with you. People didn't have this beautiful, let's say, alternative that they didn't pick. People had two choices, like the revolution, or what they call a revolution, and Assad. And many people picked Assad or stood by Assad based on different reasons and different factors. But in 2024, his popularity in Syria, it was in the minimum level. Like, I was in Syria in 2014, a few weeks before the regime change. And when I spoke, let's say, if I speak with 10 people, 9 of them were not criticizing the government, they were cursing the government. Like, this beyond the criticism. Yeah. So the situation was cooked, and there was a really denial from the regime or the government of the reality in the country. Yeah. If you feed the people, whoever is governing, that's secondary. But if you don't feed the people or cannot feed the people, let's say, and then the politics is in your hands, then that is going to be the game changer. So yes. I think the war, 7 years of war, Assad had a big popularity, 2011, 2017. How can he mobilize all these forces and continue fighting? Because he had grassroots support. But yes. Then when Trump shifted the strategy from a hot warfare into an economic warfare, they really hit him where it hurts the most. And that is, he cannot now feed his people and he cannot feed his army. And this is when his popularity started to sink. I think even what they call the minorities in Syria, Alawites, Christians, they were unhappy with Assad. Everybody was talking like, whoever comes, what is going to be worse than this? If I can't bring bread on the table, whether it's Assad or al-Julani, it doesn't make any difference for me. I just want to feed my son, right? So this was the situation. This is also accelerated the regime change, which was so quick. 14 years of war, and then in 14 days, regime change happened.
Yeah.
Now, before the regime change, we covered lots of issues, but there is one thing I want to ask you, and that is in 2008. So 2006 war, you mentioned, of course, Hezbollah, they have used anti-tank rockets, many of which were from the Syrian army stockpiles.
Yes.
They were bragging about it. Assad, after the July war 2006, he said, this is not only victory for Lebanon, this is a victory for Syria. So he made the let's say October war of himself, like comparing to the 1973 war against Israel. So he became, let's say, strong also among his own people. But 2 years so here when the Americans really wanted to let's say weaken him or take him out of power, but Sarkozy convinced back then the US that he wants to try for the last time. He invited him to Paris on the French National Day. They rolled him a red carpet treatment. I mean, if you went to his hotel in Paris, they were like packed with journalists. And then you have world leaders. They didn't have as many journalists that Assad had because they wanted to persuade him. They wanted to give him the impression that he's an important person, that he just needs to shake hands with Ehud Olmert. And then they put him on the podium. It was so planned that so obvious, it's caught on camera, how everyone basically, from the foreign minister of France, from Hamad bin Jassim back then, from Ban Ki-moon, they were all first convincing or bringing the Ehud Olmert closer to Bashar. And then when Bashar sees that Olmert is coming to him, he turns his back and he runs away from the podium somewhere far away. And this is when, according to my sources, that the West, let's say collective West, were fed up with Bashar, that they want to remove him. But here's the question. Now, he didn't shake hands with Ehud Olmert, although they were in indirect talks multiple times for a peace agreement. Was the issue of shaking hands or recognition of Israel or supporting the Palestinian armed struggle and the Lebanese resistance, let's say armed struggle against Israel, a matter of principle for him, or because this was also benefiting him to consolidate his power? In Syria, the issue of Palestine was always central. Like once we open our eyes, they feed us this with our milk, So I also, now that Assad is gone, I also want to understand that at some point, Assad didn't compromise, and this was not in favor of Syria, like even against the interests of Syria. He was not flexible in certain things. I'm not saying he should have shaken hands with Ehud Olmert. All I'm saying is his father in the 90s, when the Americans asked him to participate in the Iraq war to liberate Kuwait, back then he saw Soviet Union is gone. I have to be more flexible in this case because the Americans are the superpower. But now America again is superpower. Russia is not the Soviet Union. They have good ties with Israel. And Iran has shown to the world that their interests and their national security, of course, comes of priority. But Assad, until the last moment in October 2024, when the Jordanian foreign minister came to Damascus and told him, in November, there is going to be a ceasefire agreement in Lebanon, and we expect you to participate in this as a partner, which means you have to seal the borders, you have to cut the supply chains to Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is already being weakened at the current moment. When you do that, the Americans will reopen ties with you. And he rejected it. And only 3 weeks later, the attack of HTS happened. So I'm really interested, what was he standing on? Like, was this a principle? Was this an interest? Why all the time he said no?
Look, the short answer is because he could never say yes and stay in power. The short answer is that if al-Julani today is allowing the Israelis to occupy as much land as they want in southern Syria, he is not retaliating in any way, etc., etc. If Assad had shaken hands in 2008, his relationship with Hezbollah would be in a disastrous position, And he would probably end up being asked to retake Lebanon by defeating Hezbollah, including by besieging it and working with the Israelis. So there wasn't just the idea of a handshake. There was what happens next. Because part of any agreement is going to involve dismantling Hezbollah. How does he deal with an unstable Iraq on one side and an unstable Lebanon on the other without Syria itself becoming destabilized? With major internal dissent. This is thinking about 2008. Okay?
Yes.
If the Lebanese want Bashar gone because of Hariri, because of the killing of Kamal Jumblat, because of the Christian leaders that were killed in Lebanon by the Assad family, because all of that. And in Iraq, there's a double insurgency, a jihadi insurgency, or a Sunni jihadi insurgency, and a Shia jihadi insurgency. How does he survive if he makes peace with the Israelis? He would have to fight both on behalf of others in the same way that Saddam was sent to fight Iran on behalf of the Gulf and on behalf of the other Arabs. And he couldn't sell that kind of story successfully to his public and to his security officials and to his army. In 2006, you declare a major victory, and then he made the speech, I think, where he called the Arab leaders Ashbah Rijal, half men. You know? Then he shakes hands with the Israelis. It wasn't going to fly. He couldn't sell it internally. And as an Alawite, he was the last person who could make peace. On the question of Palestine, only the Sunnis can make peace. And even then, I'm not convinced that they can or that they all can. Even that, I don't find it very tenable. But for an Alawite to do it, it would bring about the wrath of every radical Sunni in the world against this regime, which ended up incidentally happening anyway in 2011. In 2024, he was trying to execute some kind of turn gently. So he was trying to put distance between himself and the Iranians. And he didn't allow Hezbollah to use Syria for the war. So he tried to maintain neutrality. But that was precisely the problem, in the sense that for Hezbollah, what ended up becoming the big military problem, which we can speculate on, was that they didn't fully commit to the war on October 8th, against the advice of Hezbollah's military commanders, who said to Nasrallah that you can't have a support front. You can have a war or a peace, but you can't half-ass it. You can't go halfway. So because the whole resistance axis couldn't jump and fight in a truly committed manner, which, by the way, when Muhammad Daif, I think it was, issued his statement on 7 October, he said, everybody come in now. In the Palestinian territories, in the West Bank, in the 48 territories, in Lebanon, in Syria, now is the time for the Great War. But nobody joined, and they ended up being taken out one by one.
Yes.
So the problem for the whole resistance axis was that they couldn't commit. When push came to shove, when they were called, they had nothing. They weren't willing. It turns out that it was just hot air and rhetoric.
Here, it's the also one of the problem was, and it gets me lots of into trouble among my commentators every time I mention this fact, and that is Iran's foreign minister visited Syria also in October, and he was encouraging or urging Assad to allow Iran-linked groups to open a front line against on the Golan Heights, and Assad told them, "You're either with us in this or you're not. It's not
Exactly.
one leg here and one leg there. You cannot open front lines and you are sitting in Iran." This was the answer that they didn't like in Iran, and I think this was one of the reasons why they didn't show any enthusiasm to save Assad at the end of the day. And also after Assad left, they spoke badly, let's say, on his back, the foreign minister and others. But one of the reasons was Iran wanted to open a third or a fourth front line from Syria, whereas Syria is devastated, and they cannot fight for over 5 days. They don't have the fuel in Syria. If Israel expands the war and starts bombing Damascus, then the Syrian army has to intervene. And without fuel to operate your military, how are you going to fight, basically? This is a suicidal mission, right?
What you're identifying, Kevork, is the fundamental problem with the alliance of the minorities. The minorities are too parochial to be anybody's allies. It doesn't really work. The whole theory of an alliance of minorities has been animating the Lebanese Christians, Israeli theoreticians, Alawites, the Shia, everybody got involved in this kind of speculation. There's a harsher reality. An alliance of minorities means that everybody focuses first and foremost on their own survival and on their own interests, and doesn't actually commit to the big fight in a way that would win it. In a war, unless you go into a full war of attrition, which none of these countries can fight, because none of these countries can defend their infrastructure from air attacks.
Yes.
That means that the first blow has to be decisive. In 73, the Syrians failed to deliver the decisive aerial first blow that they were required to deliver. In 2023, the rest of the resistance axis failed to step up. We can imagine what kind of future we would be in if the Iranians had fully opened their arsenals on October 8th and started attacking, and so did the Iraqis, and so did the Lebanese, and. But the problem was that the Iranians kept on using this card as a deterrent, that we will threaten the Americans, which is what I thought this was a credible deterrent. They kept on using this deterrent that we would set the whole region on fire without actually doing so, which meant that the fire moved from one spot to the next, to the next, to the next, with the Iranians being absolutely hopeless and helpless and incapable of doing anything. This is the result. And now Yemen is being dismantled, and the Houthi are going to be receiving very severe blows and are receiving severe blows, and the Iranians won't do anything, and they will end up being isolated, faced with a choice. Either accept that the Islamic revolution has catastrophically failed, which means regime change internally, or die in a blaze of glory, and for what purpose?
But isn't this already happening slowly after the death of the former president Raisi under the reformists now? Like, you see a soft swift in the approach of Iran.
If Assad teaches us anything, is that you can't accomplish soft switches. You know, the problem that Iran has is huge. 40 years of work on exporting the Islamic revolution have turned to ash. And Khamenei's designated successor and his key commanders have all died before him. And the credibility of the Islamic revolution internally is gone. And you see that in the collapse of the currency. And the question then becomes, why should there be sanctions and a revolutionary regime when in reality the revolution has failed and you can't deliver anything? And if they make a deal with the Americans, it would make everything worse, for the same exact reason that for Assad, shaking hands with Olmert was impossible. The problem was for them, the problem is now for the Iranians, that if they make a deal with what they call the Great Satan, in what sense is this an Islamic revolution? And if this isn't an Islamic revolution, why is Khamenei in power? And why should the Assembly of Experts choose Khamenei's successor? So the reality that's happening now is that Trump doesn't really need a war with Iran, and if he wages one, nobody knows how wars end. You know, the reality is that Iran's own internal narrative has fully collapsed. This has been the greatest success for the Israelis.
So you anticipate in this case probably more internal change in the country, probably through protests, or because war against Iran, it's going to have big repercussions on the Gulf countries.
Yeah. If they decide to attack the Gulf countries are saying we're not going to allow the Americans to use our airspace or to use bases on our territory. So the Americans will have to run this out of Diego Garcia and out of aircraft carriers.
Diego Garcia is located in
the Indian Ocean.
Indian Ocean.
The main base on the in the Indian Ocean that is, you know, within refueling range. Refueling range, with refueling and with all kinds of things. So the Americans could fight the war this way if they want to, and they could cause some serious damage this way. But frankly, maintaining the pressure on Iran is slowly collapsing the regime because they know that they need sanctions relief. They have deep internal divisions at this stage. Khamenei, in a way, consolidated too much, but then the designated successor that he wanted to hand over to Raisi died, and we don't know
Who was
how.
that person? Who was that person?
I think it was Raisi.
Raisi.
I think if you look at the trajectory of Raisi, he was in the judiciary, meaning that he was deeply involved in investigations and in things like that. Then he went to the presidency and he became president. This was giving him the executive experience necessary to run the country. The next logical step would have been, for somebody who's such a hardliner, would have, and of his age, would have been supreme leader after Khamenei. The other candidate seems to be Mujtaba. This would be a strong candidate, but then for the Iranian public, why did we get rid of the Shah only to make this into a hereditary thing? Why? What's the reasoning behind it? So they're facing a real crisis of legitimacy. And if they appoint some old 80-year-old cleric to be supreme leader, he's never going to be able to govern. Because there are so many levers of power in Iran that you have to consolidate over and control in order to govern effectively, like Khamenei does, then an old cleric with no background is going to be useless.
Yes.
So the Iranians are reaching the end of the line here. And the big beneficiaries for that in the short term are the Israelis, but in the long term are the Turks.
Yes. I was going to come to that with you.
Yeah.
Now that Turkey is also expanding in Syria, and they said they have struck a deal with the Jolani government to build an airbase in central Syria in Palmyra T4 airbase. Yesterday, Israel bombed it. Now we have two contradictory reports, or maybe they are not contradictions. On one side, Israeli reports say that the Israelis have opened back channels with the Jolani regime through MBS in Saudi Arabia. Maybe Trump meets with Jolani next month in Saudi Arabia. And on the other hand, Israel is setting the red line for the Turks or Erdogan not to expand or build a military base here. So what is the approach of Israel vis-a-vis Jolani in this case and Turkey?
Look, the Israelis are in the long term in a pretty difficult position. I'll go over why. Let's start with the Trump question. I think from Trump's perspective, if he meets Jolani tomorrow, and then the next day there's another massacre, this is humiliating for Trump. This is a major embarrassment. And there is absolutely no reason for him to meet with Jolani, even for normalization, until the guy actually consolidates in Syria. And he's not in a position to consolidate. And if you look at Islamic State channels and what they're saying about Jolani, they call him Ahmad Adim al-Shara. So not Ahmad al-Shara. Ahmad, the guy with no Shara. Shara meaning Sharia.
No.
So they view him as somebody who has abandoned Islam already. At least some factions within the jihadi community do. This is why he's so keen to reward some of the foreign fighters and give them positions, because this is the only way that he can keep them in line. Because ideologically, he's doing things that are unacceptable to them.
Yes.
I mean, okay, so he appointed one Christian minister and one Druze minister and one Alawite minister. That's
and one
bad.
woman.
And one of them is a woman. Yes, a Christian woman, apparently. That's terrible from the jihadi perspective. That's a condemnation against him from the jihadi perspective. So he's being pulled in these two directions. And the Israelis don't know if they want to get rid of him or not. And the Iranians and the Iraqis don't know if they want to fight or not. And there's this looming possibility of the Israelis and the Iranians being pragmatic and working together to reinforce southern Syria, to control and contain Turkey, to preserve the Alawites of the coast and the Shia of Lebanon. In the middle of this mess, Trump is going to go and stake his credibility by meeting with a guy who used to send suicide car bombs up and down Iraq and Syria. I think it's absurd. I've long defended Trump and said that this guy is smart, you should pay attention, he's doing things that you're not noticing, be careful. This would convince me that I was completely wrong.
Maybe behind closed doors, not publicly, Damien, because Giuliani can also offer a few.
There's no reason to meet him.
He can offer one thing that is important for Trump. Yeah, there is no need. He can, of course, meet the more junior officer or advisor in the national security apparatus in the US. He does, of course. Trump is cherry on top of the cake. That should be formal relationship between both sides. Embassy reopen again. There's many steps before a formal meeting between both sides. But Giuliani can offer not only normalization of relations with Israel, but also receiving Palestinians from Gaza, because they're talking about settling them in eastern Syria, in Deir ez-Zor, Hasakeh, and Raqqa, and in an impoverished conditions, let's say. This is why one of the main reasons why Egypt didn't receive the Palestinians, bringing them in a deserty place under 10 cities. These conditions could trigger, let's say, some people to go back or try to invade or try to liberate their Gaza Strip again, and this will cause problems between Israel and Egypt. Now, if they are going to try to start trigger a change in Iraq, they could bring all the Palestinians, or tens of thousands of them, or hundreds of thousands of them, and settle them on the borders with Iraq.
So I want to say two things. First, I accept that this is a possibility, that this is something that Shara can offer. Second, I don't accept that the price for that necessarily includes meeting Trump.
Yes.
Because if you're Trump, the last thing that you want to do is to have a photo op with somebody who has such a low potential viability and high potential risk. So I accept that part of the Israeli plan may be to move Palestinians to Syria. I accept that. And I accept that this would be favorable to Turkey in a very cynical way, in that it would allow them to have a Sunni community that they can recruit from and send to war in Iraq to fulfill the Turkish ambition of controlling Kirkuk and Mosul and adding them to the Turkish Republic, and possibly even going down to Erbil, and possibly going all the way to Baghdad. I accept that the Palestinians could be utilized by the Turks in this way, given the youth of the population and given the importance to Turkey of controlling Iraqi oil and gas, because that's the only thing that would allow them to close their current account deficit.
Yes.
And if the Turks close their current account deficit, they become a huge regional power, huge and global power. They become the most important Muslim country functioning today.
Yes.
So I accept this, and I accept this level of cynicism. Fine by me. And I think that's much more important than meeting with Trump or not meeting with Trump. I think this is just noise.
Yes.
As for the airports in Syria, the Turkish airports in Syria, this is a real problem for the Israelis. Because what is being reported is that the Turks would establish some kind of air defense, And with that will come drones. And then you end up with the following situation. You end up with Turkish drones able to hit Druze areas in Suwaida, but also to hit the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are in part a front for the PKK, from the rear. And this would allow the Turks to become the most dominant player in Syria. This, for the Israelis, is a nightmare. They don't want Turkey this close to their borders. The problem for the Israelis is the best possible scenario for them is the 1990 status quo. But they couldn't let that status quo continue. The best case scenario for them would be divided region, each party governing its own little tin pot state, etc.
Is this under federalism?
Under
federalism? Is this under federalism or mini states like we do?
Like these states being in the semi-functional, dysfunctional state that they've been. What's coming now is that if the Turks actually consolidate in Syria and allow it to be governed as well as Turkey, this would start creating ideas in Jordan and in Iraq and in Egypt and in the Gulf about the return of the caliphate. And in every country in the Middle East, the most organized and capable opposition force is the Muslim Brotherhood.
Definitely. And so the most funded.
Say again?
The most funded as well.
And the most funded, and they are the ones who want to restore the caliphate.
Yeah.
And for the Israelis, this would be a nightmare. For the Israelis, this would be a disaster. Because it would mean that the problem that these countries have had, which is that each one of them looks out only for its own interests and cannot act in concert, would be solved because there would be Sunni leadership operating out of Ankara or Istanbul, dictating how the region works. And this would be a state that has massive strategic depth, huge popular support, buy-in from the majority Sunni community, and would become the major threat to Israel. And this has been the project that Erdogan is working on, and this has been the project of the Muslim Brotherhood since 1928, created to restore the Islamic Caliphate. So the problem that the Israelis have is that in the long term, the chaos that has been caused in the region, in part through their own involvement, is bringing us back to pre-1914 and into the region being a Turkish sphere of influence, with the Sunnis as the dominant group. And the Sunnis as the dominant group cannot tolerate a Jewish state on the Holy Land, neither religiously nor practically, because these are their ethnic and religious kin that are being abused by the Israelis.
Oh, this is just leading me to say that Syria, or what used to be Syria, is going to face this new military. This is going to be a new confrontation zone now between the new Ottoman Turkey and Israel. This will definitely accelerate the demise of the borders of Syria. It will definitely lead into some Israeli accounts, which I believe are affiliated to the cyber units of Israel. They are publishing maps, and the coastal cities of Syria, they are trying to bring it into Lebanon. I don't know if you accept that. Guys there, do we need a referendum in Lebanon? I know the dilemma in Lebanon. I lived there for 5 years, and I truly understand all the dilemma that the Lebanese when they speak. Sometimes I myself feel like I'm a Lebanese when I'm in Lebanon, you know, and yeah. But so in this case, what I'm seeing here is Syria is going to be a sphere of influence between Turkey and Israel. There is no other power can overcome the Syrian territory. Aleppo, Idlib, Homs is Turkish influence with no aerial presence, no air forces allowed from the Israeli side, and then the Israelis are in Golan, Quneitira, Sueda, Daraa, probably Damascus, because I mean, Smotrich only a few months ago, he said our border stretches between Jerusalem to Damascus. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that the Israeli tanks would roll into Damascus. So this is the end of Syria, Psychospico Syria, and
Yes.
what was used to be called the Syrian identity or Pan-Arabism. Now Syrians are between a Turkish, Neo-Ottoman sphere of
Correct.
influence or American-Israeli sphere of influence. There is no
So the
other.
first thing I wrote when Assad left Syria was that it was Atatürk who died again. Because the idea of the nation state in the Levant was initiated by Atatürk.
Yes.
And Baathism and Pan-Arabism were, in a sense, a reaction, and in another sense, an attempt at embracing modernity, in part by being secular and ditching Islam. Erdogan began to reverse that trend within Turkey, and with the fall of Assad, it's now reversed in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon as well. And now there's a front line between the Turkish sphere and the Persian sphere. Let's see if Persia survives in its current form or in what form it reemerges afterwards and after how long, and between the Jewish state. And it's not just Syria that's a zone of combat, it's also Lebanon. Yes. Because within Lebanon, North Lebanon, if you tell them tomorrow morning, we're going to issue you Turkish passports and you'll be allowed to just be part of this whole region extending from Syria into Lebanon, into Turkey, they wouldn't say no.
Yes.
Big parts of Sunni North Lebanon would not object to this. Which leaves the minorities of Lebanon, Syria, in an extremely difficult position. They're looking to Israel for leadership, but I don't view an alliance of the minorities as viable. It just doesn't work. So
we don't really know what's the solution yet, and probably another century, another century of conflict, and we pass away from this life, and the region is still boiling, and strategic events are occurring every year. They say this is the last 1/3 of this crisis, and then new thirds come and emerge. So
if I can end with a prediction, I think the next 100 years are going to be tough.
Yes, that's. I think you're correct, and you will be correct, and we have to document this and keep it on YouTube. So 100 years later, when people watch this conversation on YouTube, they say, "See, Kevork and Firas were correct." Firas, I want to thank you so much, first of all, for coming. Many things you said have provoked my mind, because what I was grown up in Syria, and we were educated in a certain way. We heard certain things. Narratives were different, and I heard completely different narratives from you. So this completes the picture in my mind. And I always tell my audience, when I host guests, I would like to listen and learn. So I learned a lot from you, and I agreed and disagreed. But it's not my style when I disagree with a person. Come and I'm trying to prove that he's not right.
You're a very gracious host. You're a very gracious host. Thank you.
This is not my style. I'm just really trying to bring people with different opinions. I invited people who are completely pro-Jolani, but they don't come to the show. So I invited left, right, center. So I think your analysis will be much appreciated, and we will definitely follow up on the conversation that we had today. Guys, the X account of Firas is in the description below, and also his website, geopolitics.com, is in the description below. You can follow his analysis, his insights as well. And I also would like to thank you all for tuning in to today's live streaming.
Thank you
and
so much
for your patience.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Me too. We will definitely do in the near future a follow-up. So thank you so much, guys, for tuning in to today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, whether you're watching this on YouTube, on Rumble, on Ganjing Word. And I will see you tomorrow on the 4th of April, 2025. I will come with another commentary video. So peace be upon you, upon your families. Salam.